Ave Maria. Wow, that's gone weird. Hello. Hello, Shiloh. Hello. And welcome to the long patrol of the Battle of Shiloh. So, if you've already watched the live, which you might have done by the time this comes out, you will know A, that while you're seeing this long patrol, I am probably losing my hair in charge of teenagers. If you watch the long patrol, which will come out tomorrow, you'll notice that I've included a little bit about Justin Craig in that, including a mention of their advert, because I just thought it'd be cool to discuss it. Whereas I'm not including that here. That's because I have a policy of not including things about employers in ones where I'm going to potentially be contentious. And the Battle of Shiloh is contentious. It's contentious in, I would argue, for 3 reasons. 1, it's the entry into slaughter. And it's in the theatre which people weren't expecting there to be a slaughter. After the Battle of Bull Run, they expected slaughter in the west. Well, in the east, they didn't expect it in the west. The west was a theatre of manoeuvre. Not slaughter, surely not. It was contentious because of Halleck and the way he kept looking for reasons to get rid of Grant, because whilst Halleck was a fine general, he was not a great general. He was a fine administrator, a fine strategist in an extent. He wasn't a great one. And he was not good with Grant, who was prone to who achieve things. Halleck was prone to go, well, he was a drunk before the war, so I'll get rid of him. Any chance he gets, he dismisses or demotes or slights Grant. In fact, at one point, Grant actually writes to him, I must have enemies between you and myself, because he can't understand why he's being treated by Halleck the way he is. Halleck replies, you're mistaken. There is no enemy between you and me. Now, that can, in one way, sound confident. We have an open relationship. It can also sound like, well, yeah, there's no enemies between you and me. I'm the enemy. You can take it as you will. And finally, it's contentious because of the way the battle is fought. Because there is the simple reading of it, and there is the realistic reading of it, in my mind. And the realistic reading, in my mind, comes back to something which Grant wrote later in life. Some of these critics claim that Shiloh was won when Johnston fell, and that if he had not fallen, the army under me would have been annihilated or captured. It's defeated the Confederates at Shiloh. There is a little doubt that we would have been disgracefully beaten if all the shells and bullets fired by us had passed harmlessly over the enemy, and if all of theirs had taken effect. Commanding generals are liable to be killed during engagements. Well, really not a good thing. And the fact that he was shot, Johnston was leading a brigade to induce it to make a charge, which had been repeatedly ordered. It's evidence that it was neither the universal demoralization on our side, nor the unbound confidence on theirs which has been claimed. There was, in fact, no hour during the day when I doubted the eventual defeat of the enemy. Although I was disappointed that reinforcements so near at hand did not arrive at an earlier hour. There is great contention over the fact orders which were received by Lee Wallace and what he was supposed to do. It's basically torn to the charge of the Light Brigade again. There's all sorts of orders flying around. Right. The point is, the Battle of Shiloh takes place. Halleck has already dismissed Grant once, and then reappointed him. After Shiloh, he will make him his second in command, and then when he's promoted away, he has to give him the command of an army because Lincoln basically goes, "You will," or "I will." Pretty much, this entire campaign, Shiloh, is part of a river campaign. It's part of the various rivers going on. The whole point of this war and the war in the West is it's a war of railroads and it's a war of rivers. It's a war of logistics and maneuver. You cannot maneuver troops quickly over land. You can't. Not this time. Especially not if you're the Union. Union cavalry, we will get into at some point, but the Union cavalry is... Ugh. I don't know what happens to them because they have people, including Grant, who are actually fairly decent at questions. Lots of people who are excellent in the saddle. To get very senior ranks. And yet Union cavalry, even in the West, is always a case of... Oh. I wonder if it's perhaps... It is the fact that this is a war of maneuver with heavy equipment and the cavalry can't take the heavy equipment with them, or maybe it's because really there isn't as much in the Confederacy for them to go and raid as there is in the North. Or alternatively, there is the point that perhaps what are perfectly competent officers at the ranks of captain and major, the moment they get to colonel, brigadier, and oh lord, major general of any kind of role, suddenly lose their brain power. We'll leave that to one side. But anyway, if you look at this map, and I'm going to extend it, you will see that pretty much everyone is moving along either a railway or a river. And there's a reason for that. The roads are terrible. I mean, the Roman army would be absolutely slaughtering their quartermasters at this point. Oh, good lord, what's that? And I'm not joking. The Roman army and their civil engineering corps, so their sort of corps of engineers, their architects, would be looking at them and they'd be sort of going, "Excuse me, Vitruvius, you haven't built your roads." Apologies, Augustus, wouldn't work. It would be more a case of, "Oh, and I appear to no longer have a head, Augustus." So, infrastructure is playing its part again and is deciding the fate of the war. Again, if you're a place which pretty much has no infrastructure going through it or near it or anything worthwhile in that regards, the war's probably not going to touch you much. There's no real way to get to you. Good idea if you're ever in a zombie apocalypse and you want to avoid the zombies. Be somewhere where no infrastructure reaches you. You'll probably be fairly self-sufficient anyway. So the fates align. These are the troops are moving down. And they're moving down the rivers. They're moving down them because that is how they can move most quickly. In fact, previously, Grant has occupied Fort Henry and Donelson, and they are moving from these points to points. Basically, the key towns and the key places they want to get to are places like Pittsburgh Landing, where this battle will take place, which are key points where you can moor ships and get stuff off them. But also, critically, areas where you can moor ships and get stuff off them, and maybe hook up with a railway. If you look at this map, you can see where the railroads go, and you can see Pittsburgh Landing, Shiloh, Hamburg. You can see the whole area. You can also see where they're coming from, and the fact that Halleck is nowhere nearby, which is how Grant likes him. Halleck is the general in charge of this area at the moment. He'll go on to other roles, and as I said, I have mixed feelings about him because he's a fairly decent officer in some respects, but he has a complete and blind spot where it comes to Grant. Of jealousy is the only thing I can prescribe it to. He believes every bad rumor about Grant. Whatever the case, he will believe it. It will lead to full-blown arguments with Lincoln on regular occasions. And I'm fairly certain when people repeated to Lincoln that Grant was usually drunk, I wouldn't be surprised if that partially came from Halleck. And of course got Lincoln's famous retort, well, let me send a case of whatever he's drinking to all my other generals. Probably a better retort than what Churchill would have said, which is, bring me a case of what he's drinking so I can drink it as well. Anyway, so the American Civil War. We can't really discourse about the Civil War without getting into why it happens. Well, there is the short term, slavery. There is long term. Well, the industrialist North didn't have slavery and was performing economically better as it had a greater domestic market to keep building from when it came to competing for foreign orders. I.e., believe it or not, owners don't buy good quality goods regularly for slaves, and slaves don't have disposable income, so they don't buy things like clothes or food or utensils or all those other little things you don't really think about, but actually pretty much everyone needs to buy at some point in their lives. Those things add up. Those things keep money going around the economy, and the more money that's going around the economy, the more money circulating around the economy, the bigger the economy grows. It's the emergence of capitalism. It's what makes slavery uneconomical. Now, this is not to say slavery is not morally bad and not stupid, because it is a hoax on everyone involved. But, sadly enough, my strong suspicion is the economic does more of a, how do I put this? A catalyst for the anti-slavery movement's growth than the moral. I'd love to believe it was the moral, but I'm a historian. We get cynical after studying the first 100 years. The South had developed and an aristocratic feudalist system, but even their insular elites were jealous of the economic prosperity of the North. The South doubled down on their efforts as a result to increase the states that adhered to their philosophy, with the intention of being better able to restrain the growing power of the North, and they failed dramatically. The United States, the U.S. Civil War is kind of interesting, because if you ever look at the various maps which come up of the United States involved, and there's a really cool map. And as you can see, it illustrates if we sort of, I can put my hand around it. That's why I like it. It illustrates exactly the how the US breaks up. These are secessionist states. These are the states in red that are slave states and that secede. The yellow states are states that permitted slavery but actually don't secede. Mainly because you can argue the vast majority of people, you have to remember, don't own slaves. General Grant famously inherited a single slave and divested himself of that particular individual as quickly as he could. And now I feel really bad because I can't remember that individual's name. But the point is, the vast majority of people in a slave-owning state actually don't benefit from slavery directly. They don't own slaves. In fact, honestly, you could say actually slavery not just is a problem morally or ethically, it also is a problem economically, because for the really rich people, it's cheaper to have slaves do it than to hire people, which means they don't have to pay a wage. They barely have to pay enough for them to have food, if they really don't care. What can a slave do if you don't give them enough food? They can't exactly protest. You sell them up the river. That's where that phrase comes from. So there's an economic factor coming up. And the key point is these territories. There is a fight going on over whether or not they're going to allow slavery or not allow slavery. And why does the North really not like slavery? Well, it becomes attached to the Southern aristocracy, but also becomes attached to what is anti-industrialist philosophy. The North is very pro-economics. It's very much pushing for economic growth, for the way that they will manage and industrialize. And they see the South as standing in the way of that. They also see, and this is going to sound terrible, but it's true, there are probably more than we would like to admit in the North and in the UK when it happens, on the anti-slavery side, while thinking, well, good, that'll create more people buying my stuff when I sell it. Speaking of economics, that is pretty much the plan for how to win the war. Economics. Scott's Great Snake. It's a blockade. It's economic warfare. And you can see the Mississippi, you can see the various campaigns in the Western theater that are going on. This campaign, Shiloh, is part of what I would call the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi Rivers campaign period, which is February to June 1862. But that's building on the campaign before that, and it will then feed into the Kentucky, Tennessee, Northern Mississippi campaign, and the Vicksburg campaign, and then all the other campaigns which come into Western theater. The Western theater basically moves from one long campaign to another long campaign. And please do not think that this is an unending sea of Union victories. It really isn't. It really is not. The Confederacy win some of the battles. They are never as... Well, if you listen to Grant and you listen to Sherman, especially post-war, you'd think they were never in doubt and there was never a chance of them losing. And certainly, towards the end, it does get like that. Because the Union forces are quite that massive and quite that well supplied. But at the beginning, no. In fact, several times Union forces lose to state guards, which are pretty much standing armies, especially in, for some reason, slave states. Like to keep standing armies, pretty much. They have well trained, well disciplined state guards. I can't think why you would need a state guard if you have a large slave population. Can't think why. And these forces are well trained, well drilled, fairly well led. They also have access to some fairly decent generals. Again, the Texian War, the Texas War, the War of Mexico over Texas, was not that long in the past. You're dealing with a lot of veterans of that wandering around. America has not had a peaceful inception. It has not had a peaceful creation. America almost always seems to be at war in some way or another. They didn't start them, barring a couple versus the British. But usually they finish them. Sometimes with the French help versus the British. And possibly after getting beaten up by Canadians when they're fighting the British. But we'll leave that to one side. Yeah, let's just agree to it. The Canadians are a bit mean. So, the war in the East so far. Well, if you wanted to depress people, and this is probably going to come out in the live, you start off with the strategic idea behind the war in the East. Right now. Forward to Richmond! Onward to Washington! We will have victory in the day! Bit more interesting and decisive than we will have victory by the war will be over by Christmas. Which Christmas? Well, that's the mystery. However, this is the straight arrow school of military strategy. It is the idea that we will, in a coup de main, deliver a coup de grace, which will win us the war by going straight at their center of gravity. There is a small problem with all of this. Washington is, yes, the center of political gravity, I would argue, for the North. However, your main problem is not Washington. Your main problem is another city called New York and another city called Chicago. Those are your main problems. And all the industry that exists between New York and Chicago. Yes, you could take Washington. I don't think it would end the war. And it goes back to this problem here. The problem is the idea of the slavery issues, the economic issues, they turn into an identity politics. An especially vicious kind of identity politics in the South. To an extent that the moment someone who isn't a Democrat becomes president, they know what the Republicans going to do. It didn't matter. It wouldn't have mattered if it was Seward or whoever it was who was president. Or Seward might have decided to start a war with Britain to try and prevent a war, a split up. In which case, he'd probably still have to deal with a split up, but he would have been fighting a war against Britain at the same time, which would mean Britain would have shamelessly supplied the Confederacy with everything they needed. we'd already be at war. It's a different scenario. When war happens, we don't want to get involved because one's a slave state. If war was already taking place, the enemy of my enemy, no matter how untasteful, is my friend. Remember, we did ally with the Soviet Union in World War II. So, this means at the moment, even before Lincoln becomes president, they are preparing for it. Even before Lincoln announces his candidacy, they are preparing for it. There are arms being sold from federal armories to the state guards. And when I say arms, I mean heavy artillery. I'm sorry? This is kind of like, for me, the people who decide they're going. You see, there are two groups of hunters in this world. I notice people who go hunting for in America, etc. There are the people who take their granddad's rifle, their family heirloom, which has been passed down through generations and is a lovely, often single-shot weapon. It's a really cool family piece, and they go out, and there is a sort of honor and fairness in that. Yes, it's a deer versus a rifle, but there is a fairness in it. And there are the people who take what is a military-grade assault rifle with probably technically not legal underslung grenade launcher attachment, night scope, and pretty much everything else, as if they're going off to fight World War III against the poor deer. Again, if you're a state guard, your main jobs are to support the Federal Army, which has all the heavy weaponry, who you're buying them off, and in the case of a war versus Mexico, which some of these states which are buying this are really not likely to get. Texas State Guard, I can understand buying some of the stuff. You know? I can understand the Texians, especially, wanting to be well armed. But some of the others, they just don't make sense. But, yeah, the lovely stuff, some states that are buying it are buying a lot of equipment. They don't really need. They are doing that version of that flashy hunter. The one who you're sort of going, are you expecting to find a horde of, I don't know, armored gorillas or Bigfoot with full body armor, maybe an armored personnel carrier out there? No? Okay. Why are we quite kitted out like this then? Even funnier when they go shooting in the when they turn up like it to go hunting and go shooting in Scotland. They're sort of going, we're going after grouse. Personally, don't shoot grouse. They're not what I consider a worthy target. But if you do, it takes skill. I do understand. But if you turn up looking like you're preparing to fight and go to Ukraine and support the Ukrainians versus the Russians, then I'm slightly worried about you. More worried about you than I am the grouse right now. At that point, I get distinct urges to try and disarm you. Honestly, leave that to one side. But basically, the straight arrow school of military doctrine is what is coming on in the East. I know I went off topic there, but going back and forth, but it's the political centers of gravity. And if we go back, they are, in simple terms, sort of their identity politics became so strong that it didn't matter who became it. They were going to secede. And that starts off a war. And the moment you're starting off a war with this, well, the trouble is, if we get this little map up, well, here is the problem for the South. They should not have put a capital I use my little ring screwdriver pointer. Here in Richmond. It's not a good place to stick a capital because it's not far from Washington, for starters. And it has no defensive depth and no security. In fact, if anything, their capital should have been somewhere around this area. Nice and centrally located. Not off to one side. It's bad strategic positioning. It means everyone has to come to you, but you can be cut off from everyone else. In fact, I think St. Louis is... Yeah, St. Louis is rough. St. Louis is down here. That would have probably been a good place for a capital. Doesn't have quite, though, the industry and the economic might of Richmond, Virginia. So that's the trouble. Richmond is the industry, the industrial viability of the Confederacy. They are the military viability of the Confederacy because, again, the Virginian State Guard is one of those organizations which is surprisingly well armed, considering where the nearest borders are. And that's where they set themselves up. Without Virginia, there would have been no Confederacy. They couldn't have kept it going. They didn't have the industrial ability, really the ability to keep it going. But this means that everyone thinks that I've got a really good way, a brilliant way to win a war. Right? We just go there and we take their capital. Here is 3 facts about capitals. 1, if they're run by a moderately competent government, they tend to be heavily defended. 2, and this is important, the important people tend to be extracted from the city if it looks like it's going to fall, especially if you have less than a total complete and utter siege. In cities which have rivers in this period, you are unlikely to have a complete and total siege, i.e. a wall around it that makes such escapes impossible. Ring it with air defenses and all sorts of things. And 3. If you have such a bright idea, what makes you think a moderately competent opponent is not going to have the same bright idea and figure out you're confident, or more importantly, try to come to you the same route? And this is the problem. This is it. This is why you end up with stalemate and checkmate in the East. Because it's 2 armies basically going, I want to go that way. And the other army going, I want to go that way. And them just going, boom, 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 the whole time. And because it's such a straightforward idea, you have to be quite an arrogant general. And it's at the end of the war they do actually have 2 quite arrogant generals, Grant, Meade, in charge of the army in the East for the Unions, who will actually go, okay, let's actually do some maneuvering and something sensible and some operations. The West, though, the West is lucky. And that's kind of a strange thing because, please note, the only area where the Union actually develops remotely competent, and I say this in a nice way, remotely competent cavalry at a higher level is in the East. In the West, where you would think they would have the more competent, the more capable cavalry, they don't. Please note a second ago, I did get St. Louis, which is on my notes because that's where Holneck is, and that's, of course, in Missouri. Messed up with New Orleans, which is the one down here, which should be the capital. And is Louisiana, and would be sensible as the capital for the Confederacy. Apologies. But, no. The West is interesting. They benefit from not having Richmond or Washington. They benefit from not having the Confederate capital in New Orleans, because if the Confederate capital was in New Orleans, who knows what would happen to the various generals. They actually therefore have a chance to think. And they have enough distance from the politicians that they can think effectively. This means you get arguably some of the best strategy, some of the best tactical doctrine, and some of the best operational conceptions of the whole war. But, and I am going to rant about this for about a minute, you also get atrocious Union cavalry. They are terrible. They are awful, as I said earlier and mentioned before. They are fine up until they get above the company command level. And then at some point, they start out okay. But the further and further away they get from commanding a company, they get less and less and less okay. Until they get to the point where they are really not okay. Either in a we're going to get all our troops massively killed kind of way, or we're just going to be so weird that frankly no one is going to want to follow us anywhere, and no one even wants to be in a room alone with us kind of way. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. Anyway, let's see what the command was coming for. You'll notice that Grant has been pottling around quite a lot. So has Buell. And so has Thomas. And so has Pope. And Holneck is currently sitting up at St. Louis, which is a good point on a confluence of rivers and railways, so he can move around quite easily. Cairo is a critical place which has been got, but so was Fort Henry and Fort Donelston, because these are points which allow you to move between the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River. And of course, there's also the Mississippi River. And these are the three big rivers in this area. And they matter. They really do matter. Because if you want to move anything, you need them. So, before we go too far into this battle, we have to talk about Grant's philosophy for camps. And this is Pittsburgh Landing, the other name for the Battle of Shiloh. Okay. Grant doesn't really believe in digging trenches and preparing a defensive position when encamped. He treats every position as an offensive position. Makes sense. He's on the offense. He prefers his troops to concentrate on drill, on shooting, rather than on digging trenches. Now, does this mean his positions are completely unprepared? No, because he tends to have the artillery camped in positions which are going to mean that if you have to withdraw, you have a fine base of fire to pull back onto. He also tends to have quite a lot of active patrolling going on, although different subordinates interpret that in different ways. And he tends to have a fairly decent quantity of sentries posted. Now, I, however, am a bit of a cynic. This might have come across to you before. And I would add something else to Grant on this one. He is going up against prepared defensive positions. He knows he's going to lose a lot of troops attacking them. He knows also if he can avoid having to attack them, he's going to lose less troops, use up less material, and less food, and have an easier time logistically. Now, you can do 3 ways of avoiding fighting prepared positions. You can go round them. You can siege them. Or you can draw them out. If you want control and the ability to move stuff up and down the rivers, because he depends on people like Admiral Porter, etc., bringing supplies to him, you can't go round them. And if you siege them, it's going to take a long time, and you're probably going to end up having to assault them anyway. But drawing them out is kind of risky. Because what kind of reason are the enemy going to have coming out? Well, if they've got General Burgard, etc., in charge of them, probably no reason is going to pull them out, because Burgard is an engineering artilleryman who would never leave at a prepared defense position, even if you were paying him and pointing a shotgun at his head. He's kind of the Confederate version of McClellan. But if you're not fighting Burgard, if you're fighting the commander at this point, Sidney Johnson, he's just about aggressive enough. But Sidney Johnson is just about aggressive enough. He's a Texian. He was a general in the Texian, U.S. Army and the Confederacy. He is a real fighting general. A real fighting general. Aggressive to a fault. Grant knows this. Grant was involved in the Mexican War. Grant was involved in several actions. He has experience. He's also got various people gathering intelligence for him. He likes to get this information. You either don't have to worry about security because you're facing someone like Burgard who won't come out and fight you, or you're laying a trap for someone who will. And that is the interesting thing, because Grant, when he's positioning his forces, he does have a reserve. He has Lew Wallace's division, which is positioned back further up the river. In fact, it's 5 miles north, downstream of Bisbee Landing, at Crump's Landing. He's also got some troops from Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio heading towards him, and he knows they're coming his way. In fact, they had reached Savannah, and the troops under the division under the command of William Bull Nelson were actually instructed by Grant to encamp there instead of immediately crossing the river. So he had a division of another army, of Boyle's army, across the river. He has his own army in a sort of laid out position, bivouac camping style. Is artillery organized? I'm not saying he did do it like this on purpose. I'm not saying he was laying a trap. If it was a calculated scenario like that, he definitely doesn't seem to discuss it with people or put it forward. And there are reasons for believing this wasn't the case, but when you look at the dispositions and you consider how Clarke conducts himself during the battle and around the time before and after the battle, there is part of you which just sort of think, if you're me, Grant might have had this as a backup idea. And there's also the fact that he knows the river is his strongest area. He knows he has big gun support from the river, from the gunboats. Anyway, the Battle of Shiloh, it starts. Grant telegraphed a message to Holnack on the night of the April 5th. And said, I have scarcely the faintest idea of an attack general on being made upon us, but will be prepared should such a thing take place. Now, it is both reassuring Halleck he's in position, he's fine. If there is attack, he's prepared for it. But also that it's unlikely. My personal view is I would believe a pinch of salt any communications between Grant and Halleck. Reason for this is Grant isn't stupid enough to believe that things are all rosy with Halleck after the way Halleck's treated him, no matter what he might protest and how nice and knave he might play. There is an advantage to a general playing knave. Playing naive is an advantage, but being it is a different matter. And I would not be surprised if they had an inkling things were coming their way. But that they also didn't want Halleck to be coming down and trying to take charge. No one wanted that. No one wanted Halleck to come and take charge. But you can see the little arrow up there saying Lee Wallace. He's up there. You've got quite an interesting disposition of troops. You've got Sherman on his furthest flank. You've got McClelland. You've got Prentice and Herbert. W.H. Wallace and Stewart. Those are our formations. Now, Prentice has 2 brigades under his command. McClelland has 3. W.H.L. Wallace, 3. Lee Wallace, 3. Herbert, 3. Sherman, 4. Sherman's in command of 5th Division. Lee Wallace's 3rd Division, sitting back there. And total, the Army of Tennessee consists of roughly 45,000 troops, give or take a couple hundred. The Army of the Mississippi, that is Johnson's army, well, was about 40,000 strong. So, outnumbered, but not by that much. He had his army divided into 4 corps, each with some divisions. So there was the First Corps under Major General Leonidas Polk, fairly decent general. Second Corps under Braxton Bragg, another decent general. And Third Corps under William J. Hardy. The Reserve Corps was under Brigadier General John C. Breckinridge. However, the Confederates are armed with what can be charitably described as antique weapons, including shotguns, hunting rifles, pistols, flint muskets, and some pikes. And some regiments had recently received Enfield rifles, but these regiments were very little light in terms of training on them, as they very recently received them. And what you find is the people like Braxton Bragg's men from Pensacola are probably the best trained, but have the least, some of the least well equipped in terms of the quality of the weapons. Grant's army has 32 regiments out of 62 which have had combat experience at Fort Donelson, and half his artillery batteries and about 3/4 of his cavalry are combat veterans. So, basically, the purpose of the attack was to go, as far as Johnson was concerned, Polk will attack the left, Bragg the centre, Hardy the right, and Breckinridge in reserve. Now, I'm just going to say something that it spikes here, but by a point in the afternoon, it does look like they've managed to switch places, which is interesting. The attack on Grant was originally planned for April the 4th, which would have been before Nelson and other units could have been in position. But it gets delayed by units getting lost in the woods, traffic jams, and a heavy rainstorm wiping out roads. In fact, it took Johnston 3 days to move his army 23 miles. In fact, if it had taken them any longer, Grant and Buell would have probably actually combined their armies, and Johnston would have been taking on 80,000 odd troops, probably. It's just not sensible. Now, why do I have a picture of Colonel Everett Peabody? Well, because he's important. He's part of General Benjamin Prentice's 1st Brigade. And 3 a.m. on the 6th, he sends out a patrol. He's been getting reports of Confederate contacts over the last few days, and he believes that quite a possibility that he's going to be dealing with troops very quickly attacking him. And Everett Peabody is not a stupid man. He's survived the Battle of Lexington. His previous work had been as a civil engineer. So, yeah. He has a very good beard, which we always like. He had attended Burlington College and graduated from Harvard University in 1849. He'd worked in the railroad industry. And he was actually chief engineer of the Platte County Railroad in 1859. He was a good officer. He was part of the Army of Tennessee. and was actually in command of 1st Brigade under General Prentice in the 6th Division. So when he's getting antsy, he sends 250 infantrymen from actually the 25th Missouri, which was his old regiment, and the 12th Michigan, out on a reconnaissance patrol under the command of Major James E. Powell. At 5:15 a.m., they encountered Confederate outposts. A spirited fight took place between 5:15 a.m. and roughly 6:15 a.m. They sent messages, and of course the sound of gunfire alerted the nearest Union troops, who formed battle line positions before the Confederates were able to reach them. Remember, Confederate attack is supposed to start at 6 a.m. They're deploying for battle at 6 a.m. Interestingly enough, Prentice, when he learned that Peabody had sent out a patrol without his authorization, accused the colonel of provoking a major engagement in violation of Grant's orders, and was looking at, well, how do I put this? Court-martialing his colonel. Luckily, or unluckily for luckily for Prentice, unluckily for Peabody, and Powell, the major in command of the patrol, both Peabody and Powell were killed in the subsequent fighting, leading their men. In fact, I would say that is the thing which often causes Grant the most trouble with the history of Shiloh, is that quite so many prominent men get killed leading. People who people back home know of and think of as smart men. Because the war hasn't yet dawned on people. You know, they still think that a smart, hard-working man will get through a war fine. They don't realize that the death in war is indiscriminate. He doesn't care about those things. You're either lucky or you're not. You're in the right position or you're not. Anyway, the initial leader units, and as you can see, collapse. They fall back. Prentice especially is hard pressed and holds his position fighting as hard as he can to buy time. And there are all sorts of points where different batteries of guns are brought into play, and at different points both sides are raining batteries of over 50 guns to attack positions. And they fall back. And as they're falling back, Nelson's troops start to cross from the river, but more importantly, more troops are crossing from the river. And as shown in that map earlier, Grant has achieved a very strong defensive position. And Union gunboats are providing fire support from the river and blasting away. If we consider, go back again to this map, the USS Lexington, the USS Tyler, off to one side. The 50 guns of the main artillery battery, main artillery line, formed up. That is not something you want to attack into. That is really not something you want to attack into. And that is a day's fighting. It starts off at 6 a.m. down there. This is what it's got to by 6 p.m. General Johnston does a really good job. He gets his troops there. It's taken him 3 days to get there, but he's attacking, and he's attacking hard. Would he have won a battle? No. Sorry, I don't think Grant was. I think there is a okay, if Johnston manages to roll all sixes and Grant rolls all bad ones, then there's a chance. But this ain't that battle for them. Johnston himself has such faith in his subordinates, etc., that he keeps having units failing to attack and failing to do what he needs to do, so he's running around. And he receives reports from Breckinridge, down here, that one of his brigades are refusing orders to advance against the Union force in a peach orchard. Johnston goes himself to make the charge by leading it personally. He leads the attacks on the Union left through the Widow's Bell cotton field against the peach orchard. Johnston is shot in his right leg behind the knee. I think he realizes, I don't think, for starters, he knows just how bad it is at that point when he's hit. There's adrenaline, there's all sorts of things rushing through your body, you're in the middle of combat, you're making decisions. Yeah, he's not noticing it. But after a while, I think he does realize how bad it is. And eventually, he starts to slump down. Unfortunately, he'd sent his surgeon, personal surgeon, to care for the wounded and Confederate troops and Yankee prisoners. And there was no medical staff in his current location. Then, for some silly reason, they get him off the horse, they don't apply a tourniquet, and they run to try and fetch a surgeon. Now, unsurprisingly, Johnson bleeds out. They found that he'd got a torn popliteal artery and internal bleeding and blood collected unnoticed in his riding boot. But still, tourniquet would have probably bought him enough time for hopefully a surgeon to arrive. The next day. Well, the next day, Grant tries to get himself killed. And the point is that Pittsburgh Landing, they have a strong defense. So, okay, they've drawn on Pittsburgh Landing. They have the troops arriving from everywhere. They have Buell turning up with even more troops. They have Lee Wallace finally getting into position. And they start advancing. And you see how the Confederates slowly have to withdraw. And slowly have to withdraw. The Union line, at its longest, had been a 3-mile front. Including 50 cannons, Lexington and Tyler's course, and all sorts of things. But Burgard called off the second attempt to attack this line at 6 p.m. as the sun set. And Burgard is not the type who's going to push it. In fact, Burgard starts to fall back almost immediately. There is rain during the night. Burgard, of course, sends a traditional telegram to President Davis announcing complete victory. Whereas Grant was getting roughly 20+ thousand reinforcements. Burgard wasn't getting any reinforcements. This is the classic issue for the Confederacy. The army has attacked. We have won a glorious victory. We are now not able to reinforce it to do anything. And the next day, Unions again, well, we didn't acknowledge we defeated. We've got reinforcements. Attack! And as a result, So, the result. Well, on April the 7th, the Union Army numbered 45,000 men. The Confederates numbered less than 20,000. Although Buell, of course, tries to claim that there were 28,000 Confederates there, but that really doesn't make much of a difference. That just means you only outnumber them by 19,000, 17,000 rather than 25,000. Nice, fine, what it becomes not 5 to, well, that's 5 to 2, no, 4.5, 9 to 4. It's just, you don't have any chance. They advanced. The Confederate troops managed to withdraw in good order, and Burgard managed to keep them together as he withdrew. There were issues in the Union command structure at this point as well, because there was Buell going, I'm independent of Grant and I can act as I wish, despite Grant being the senior officer and technically in command of both armies. But Buell is in many ways encouraged in this position by Halleck, in the way Halleck has been writing to Buell. This is a problem, which means that you have issues of command organization, so they don't really push as hard as they could. And on the 8th of April, there will be a Battle of Fallen Timbers. Jefferson Davis always attributed the loss of Johnston to being the turning point of our fate. Abraham Lincoln found himself with winning a victory, then having people try to remove Grant, Halleck actually removing Grant, and Lincoln having to, how do I put this, stamp on people quite heavily. This is the most interesting map I always find of the American Civil War. Up here we have the it's an easy victory. Let's go in a straight line, people. Believe it or not, there is some yellow up there and other places, and you sort of go, why? What happened? But really, the Western Theatre is from about here to sort of this area. And you really see a flow of the fighting as it moves really from the west and keeps moving further and further to the east as they gain ground, as they succeed. The Western Theatre of the American Civil War. It is the war. And Shiloh is the first battle which shows what it's going to be about. It's not going to matter what kind of tactical successes the Confederacy achieves. Short term, yeah, they can achieve a surprise attack. Yes, they can push the Union troops back to a hard fight, into a hard defensive position. But as long as the Union troops are able to resupply, as long as the Union troops are able to reinforce, the Confederacy only have what they have with them. They don't have the depth to carry on fighting. They don't have the depth to do any more. And they try for it. They really do try. But they don't have the depth there. They don't. And when I first read about the Battle of Shiloh, I was very young. And I was looking in a way for inspiration and leadership. And I was impressed by how calm and in control Grant remained all day. But in the end, after I thought about it for a couple of years, I realized the reason why Grant could remain calm and controlled, despite the devastating loss of so many brave men who he had had the honor of commanding. He never thought he was going to be defeated. He had reinforcements already there, had reinforcements coming. He had the supply lines and the logistics road at his back. He wasn't up against the river. His foundation was the river. And he had those gunboats with their firepower, making it inadvisable in the extreme for the Confederates to get that close to the river. You can be calm and collected when you know that you've got those certainties behind you. You don't have to worry so much. You've got your plan. You know what you're going to do. And that's when I started really thinking through this whole policy of his in terms of the camps. And I started thinking, well, if that's always the case, if you always camp in that fashion, with those things structured in that sort of way, you're always camping with the idea that you're going to possibly attract your opponent to come out and attack you. Because them coming out and fighting in the open, where you can bring your numbers to bear against their numbers when they're going to have less than you, and they can't replace them as easily as you can, or rather, as well as you can, that's an advantage. Because remember, and this is something which I think Grant understands, and a few other generals in the Union understand better than most. They can mobilize their whole society in the North. You can't mobilize the whole society in the South. You can't because some of them are slaves, but also some of the people you want to mobilize as soldiers, you can't take out of there because you need them there in case of a slave rebellion. The same reason you had those well-trained state guards in the first place. They tie those well-trained state guards in place. You can't be both prison warder and riot squad. You can't. And that's ultimately the South's biggest problem. They can never field their army, not their full army, because they need it to secure and garrison things and protect things far more than the Unions do. And the Union has more people it can call on and a larger population base to begin with. Anyway. Success was the Union's. Right. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you found it interesting. Right. We've got the Leipzig class next week, which I hope you enjoy. And yeah, we have lots of fun stuff coming up. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Take care.